I never imagined myself living in a quiet, waterfront community governed by an HOA. But after 30 years of wearing pressed suits and battling endless board meetings, I wanted a little peace and maybe a boat. A modest boat, mind you, something I could take out for fishing or sunset cruises. That was my dream when I retired. This particular neighborhood looked perfect. Small single-story homes, each with a private dock that stretched out onto the bay. The houses had pastel paint jobs and lush gardens, each yard meticulously maintained thanks to the HOA's strict landscaping rules. I met the president of the HOA on my first day moving in, a polite older gentleman who introduced himself as Stan. He handed me a thick binder of guidelines and urged me to call him for anything. If that had been the end of it, just a set of clear rules, fine. But soon enough, I learned about someone else on the board, Karen. Karen was a piece of work. She had a platinum bob haircut and a perpetual scowl that deepened with every perceived violation she could note down. She wasn't the president, the treasurer, or the secretary. Officially, she was just on the committee, but in practice, she assumed the role of neighborhood watchdog. She would knock on your door if you let the grass get half an inch too high. If your patio furniture was inappropriate, she'd cluck her tongue and deliver a lecture on the value of uniformity. She had memorized each line in the HOA bylaws the way I knew my favorite fishing routes. At first, I tried to stay under her radar. I kept my lawn immaculate. I kept any potential eyesores out of sight. Even my new hobby, a 22-foot center console boat named Seaworthy Spirit, was meticulously moored at my dock, angled precisely so it wouldn't stick out beyond the community's guidelines for dock usage. But the moment Karen saw that boat, something in her eyes shifted. It was like she had found her next subject of scrutiny or conquest. I didn't realize it at first. She'd make remarks in passing. "Oh, that boat is quite large, isn't it? Do you have the correct permit for that?" I'd nod politely and reassure her that yes, I had all the necessary papers. Over time, she grew more brazen, leaning over my fence to watch me tinker with the engine. She'd say, "Those fishing rods, are they stored properly? The HOA has certain rules about external storage, you know." I'd wave it off, telling her I kept them in my garage when not in use. I thought I was handling her pushiness just fine. But the real trouble started one late afternoon when she showed up unannounced. I was polishing Seaworthy Spirit after a day out, my hands still sticky from salt water and my face red from too much sun. Karen stood on my dock, arms crossed, the wind whipping her hair so much it made her scowl look even more severe. "What a shame," she said, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "Such a beautiful boat, but I never see it used for the greater good." I raised an eyebrow. "Greater good?" She gestured dramatically with her arms. "We have many neighbors who'd love a ride. You keep it all to yourself. Isn't that selfish?" I forced a polite smile. "I take my wife and sometimes a few friends. If people want a boat ride, they usually ask. I'm more than willing to take folks out, so long as they respect my schedule." Karen pursed her lips in a way that suggested she believed her schedule, and her idea of what was community-minded should override mine. "Well," she intoned, "just remember, this is a shared community. I'd hate to see a complaint get filed over something so trivial as boat misuse." To say I was stunned would be an understatement. Boat misuse? That was a new one, but I tried to remain calm. I simply nodded and said, "I appreciate your concern, Karen. Thanks for dropping by," before getting back to cleaning. She eventually sauntered away. I told my wife about the incident that evening. She just laughed and said, "You're not letting her bully you, are you?" We both brushed it off, thinking maybe Karen was just bored, or maybe she was trying to show off her influence. Either way, I never suspected she'd take it any further. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a tangled fight over my beloved Seaworthy Spirit. In the weeks that followed, Karen developed a habit of strolling by whenever I was outside. She'd wave in the sort of way that wasn't friendly, but more like a theatrical greeting aimed to show everyone watching that she was on official patrol. I heard from a few other neighbors that she'd been complaining about certain folks hogging community resources. It wasn't hard to guess who she meant. I was still new to the area, though, and I wasn't sure how to handle it without kicking up a neighborhood feud. I assumed, or at least hoped, that Karen would grow bored if I ignored her. But Karen was the type who, if anything, got emboldened by silence. She must have interpreted my avoidance as timidity. She turned her attention full force to seaworthy spirit. At first, it was extra rules and random notices in my mailbox referencing dock maintenance, length restrictions, or needing advanced approvals for extended usage. Then there were random messages on my answering machine from the HOA number, her voice disguised by a cough, telling me to move the boat elsewhere if it wouldn't be used regularly. It all seemed petty, but in an odd way, I could tell Karen had singled me out for her own agenda. If she had just stuck to these petty warnings, I would have endured it. I'm stubborn by nature, and I wasn't about to let a busybody neighbor ruin my retirement dream. But Karen wasn't content to merely gripe. She had bigger plans. Plans that would culminate in the day she took my boat out for a quick ride, without my knowledge or permission, and nearly turned my life into a bureaucratic nightmare. But let me not get ahead of myself, because when Karen decided to push boundaries, she made sure to bulldoze right through them in spectacular fashion. Karen's fixation with my boat escalated in small, unnerving ways. I'd glance outside and catch her strolling near my dock with a tape measure in hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. I'd walk out and ask if something was wrong, and she'd straighten up, scribble something on her clipboard, and say, just verifying the setback distances. She made it sound official, but we both knew it was nonsense. Everything about my dock and boat had been pre-approved by the HOA before I'd even purchased the property. Still, Karen's behavior was more annoying than genuinely alarming, until the night I discovered footprints along my dock. They were muddy impressions, smaller than mine, leading to the side of the boat where the gate opened. At first, I wondered if maybe a raccoon or some stray animal had been snooping around. But it was definitely a human shoe print, partial but unmistakable. I checked all the locks on the boat, which were still in place, and the deck showed no signs of forced entry. Yet, it left me uneasy. I went to Stan, the HOA president, to discuss what was happening. He listened with a frown, tapping a pen against his desk. Karen has been on the board for years, he said. She's thorough, but not usually a troublemaker unless she feels strongly about an issue. Feels strongly about my boat, apparently. I quipped, only half joking. Is there some rule that's bothering her? Anything I can address to avoid conflict? Stan skimmed through some official documents. No, everything's in order. Honestly, I think Karen might just be a bit overzealous right now. If it gets worse, let me know, and we'll address it. That was disappointing, but not surprising. HOAs often function on volunteer time. No one wanted to engage in a personal war with a neighborhood's self-appointed rule enforcer. I figured maybe, in time, Karen would find some other project to obsess over. Yet the footprints in the night suggested a curiosity that was quickly becoming invasive. One day, I stepped onto my porch to see Karen and another woman, a local real estate agent from the looks of it, standing by my boat. They were pointing at the side rail, talking animatedly. I walked over, nodding and greeting. Karen barely acknowledged me. The real estate agent made some comment about how a waterfront property with a private boat was a premium feature that could potentially raise the overall value of the community. Karen just sniffed and mumbled something about outsiders taking advantage of our shared resources. The agent gave her a puzzled look. Before I could question them further, they moved off, presumably to the next yard. It was all so bizarre. I asked the real estate agent, "You showing houses around here?" She shrugged and said, "Your neighbor invited me to do a quick property assessment, see how the community's overall values are trending. She's very concerned about maintaining standards." Standards? I echoed, not surprised. Well, good luck. Over the next week, I installed a new security camera facing the dock. Not because I wanted to spy on everyone, but because I needed peace of mind. If Karen or anyone else tried something, I wanted proof. It felt drastic, but Karen had been inching ever closer to crossing a line. The line was finally crossed on a calm Saturday morning. I woke up early, planning to take Seaworthy Spirit out for some fishing. When I stepped onto my dock, I saw that my boat cover was askew, half off, and the ropes holding the boat to the dock were loosely draped over a cleat. My stomach tightened with alarm. There was no sign of forced entry, but I could tell someone had tampered with the boat. I climbed aboard to check if anything was missing. My rods and tackle box were untouched, but the seat cushions were scattered. It looked like someone had rummaged around. Then I noticed a near-empty plastic cup tucked into a corner, like someone had been enjoying a drink. It definitely wasn't mine. Hurrying back inside, I accessed the security camera footage. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. Sometime around dawn, a figure came creeping along the dock. A slim silhouette. They fiddled with the cover and eventually hopped aboard. I stared hard at the pixels on the screen. Short hair, a certain posture, definitely a woman's build. The shape of the head and the stance looked eerily familiar. Could it really be Karen? Or was I just letting my suspicions run wild? I replayed the footage, pausing at various points. The person's face never turned fully toward the camera, but the size, the stance, everything screamed that it was her. I felt my blood pressure spike. Why would she do that? Did she think she was entitled to rummage around my boat just because she lived on the HOA board? I debated whether to confront her or to just escalate it immediately to Stan or the police. This was trespassing, plain and simple. And while I wasn't entirely sure from the grainy footage, my gut told me it was her. The missing piece was motive. If she wanted to gather evidence of some supposed rule violation, rummaging around inside my boat at dawn was beyond extreme. Yet I hesitated to accuse her outright without more solid proof. I feared it would turn into a he said, she said, and Karen was notoriously persuasive when it came to pointing fingers. So I kept quiet for the moment, at least about the camera footage. But I did place a call to Stan, telling him, somebody's messing with my boat. I have reason to believe it might be Karen. He sounded genuinely concerned, but busy. Let me talk to her, he said. I'll let you know what she says. I hung up, not feeling at all reassured. My gut told me I was dealing with a person who had few boundaries and fewer reservations about violating them. My boat, which once symbolized freedom and retirement bliss, now felt like a magnet for drama. And the strangest part? Karen hadn't even begun to show the full extent of her audacity. Because not long after, she would do the unthinkable. Take Seaworthy Spirit out on open water without my knowledge or consent, setting in motion a course of events that would eventually involve the Coast Guard. But first, there would be one more crucial piece of the puzzle. A confrontation that made her entitlement as clear as day. That confrontation happened at a neighborhood gathering, one of those annual meet and greets the HOA hosted at the community clubhouse. It was a potluck-style lunch with plastic tablecloths and folding chairs. Folks chatted about yard improvements, local fishing spots, and real estate prices. Karen was stationed by the refreshment table, sipping iced tea and surveying the room like she was the queen of some small, vinyl floor kingdom. I tried to avoid her, focusing instead on polite, small talk with neighbors. But eventually, Karen made her move. She approached with a bright, tight-lipped smile that managed to look anything but friendly. I've been meaning to speak with you, she said, tilting her head in a gesture that was almost theatrical. I kept my voice neutral. Is that so? She glanced around, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. Some of us are worried about that boat of yours. We think it's bringing down the neighborhood's aesthetics. I nearly choked on my lemonade. Aesthetics. I repeated, eyeing the middle-aged man across the room wearing neon flip-flops. We live on the water, Karen. Boats are typical here. She shrugged in a feigned show of sympathy. But your boat is always so present. Some neighbors have modest kayaks or smaller vessels, but yours looms. She paused for effect. I'm just trying to maintain standards. I responded with as much calm as I could muster. I followed every guideline when I got Seaworthy Spirit. I've got the paperwork. Everything is up to HOA code. Karen's lips tightened. She looked ready to fire back something scathing. But just then, a neighbor called her name, giving me an opening to escape. I headed to a quieter corner of the clubhouse, trying to decompress. Little did I know, I'd soon get an entirely different glimpse of Karen's twisted logic, and it came from an unexpected source. A friend of hers, a chatty neighbor I'll call Bernice, was perched on one of those collapsible chairs nearby. She seemed eager to gossip. Listen, Bernice whispered. Karen's been telling people that the reason you have that boat is just to flaunt your wealth. She thinks it sets a bad precedent, because if everyone got a big boat, the docks would look crowded. That's ridiculous, I muttered. Bernice shrugged. Karen likes to feel in control. She's also been talking about taking matters into her own hands, showing you how to properly use the boat in a community-oriented manner. I raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure what that even means. Bernice gave me a knowing look. She once borrowed someone's golf cart without asking, claiming she was giving potential buyers a tour. The owner was furious. Karen insisted she was enhancing property values by showing off the community amenities. In her mind, that made it okay. A chill went through me. It sounded like a weird pattern of boundary pushing. I thanked Bernice for the heads up, feeling both grateful and uneasy. If Karen had pulled this stunt before, who was to say she wouldn't do it again, especially with a bigger, more impressive community amenity like my boat? That night, as I sat on my porch, I realized ignoring Karen had been a mistake. She thrived on unopposed control. If I didn't stand my ground, she'd find a way to one-up me. I just hadn't realized how brazen she would be about it. And that's exactly when fate decided to toss in a strange twist, an odd superstition, you might call it, but it came in the form of an old friend calling me. We'd been out of touch, but he randomly reached out to say he'd subscribed to some new fishing channel and claimed his catches had doubled since. He was half joking, but he insisted that sometimes timing changes everything, just like subscribing to that channel seems to bring unexpected luck. So if you believe in that sort of thing, well, feel free to follow his example. But back to the story, because luck or not, the next day, Karen escalated the situation in a way no one, especially me, could have anticipated. The following morning, my wife and I decided to run errands. Usually, on weekends, I'd either be out fishing or tinkering with the boat. But we had groceries to buy and a friend's birthday gift to pick up. We left around mid-morning, waving to a couple of friendly neighbors as we drove out of the community. I didn't think much of it until, halfway through a shopping trip, my phone buzzed. It was a neighbor calling frantically. "Hey, your boat, it's gone." My heart nearly stopped. Gone? What do you mean gone? I mean, it's not at your dock. I just walked by, and there's an empty space. Ropes are still dangling, the covers tossed aside. Did you take it out? I dropped the loaf of bread I was holding. My wife's eyes went wide. No, of course not. I barked into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. Stay there, I'm on my way. We abandoned the cart, ignoring the annoyed looks from other shoppers, and rushed to the car. My mind was racing with possibilities. Had someone stolen my boat outright? Or had Karen actually followed through with her bizarre notion of demonstrating proper usage? Both possibilities churned in my gut. My wife tried to keep me calm, saying maybe there was a misunderstanding, or perhaps a neighbor had to move the boat for an emergency reason. None of it made sense. We arrived back at the house to find a small cluster of neighbors standing by my dock, gawking at the empty space. The ropes had been cast off, the cover haphazardly flung aside, and the faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air. In a daze, I checked my phone again, scrolling through missed alerts on my security camera app. Sure enough, there was footage of a figure approaching the boat, messing with the ropes, then actually starting the engine and pulling away. The sun glare made it hard to see the face clearly, but the posture, the short hair, and the nerve, it had to be Karen. At that moment, a whirlpool of emotions flooded me. Anger, disbelief, fear for my property. But above all, a sense of this is it, she's gone too far. Whether or not I could prove it was Karen, I knew in my gut she had just taken my boat out for a so-called quick ride. Worse, I had no idea how experienced she was on the water. Seaworthy spirit wasn't some toy, and if she didn't know what she was doing, she could run aground, or worse, get into serious trouble. With shaking hands, I dialed the Coast Guard's local station. I had to report a stolen vessel. It felt surreal. I never envisioned I'd be dealing with theft in my quiet retirement community, let alone theft by an HOA neighbor. But there I was, reciting the boat's registration number, describing the make, the model, and the color. My heart pounded as I relayed my suspicion. I believe a neighbor may have taken it, but I'm not certain. The officer on the line spoke calmly, assuring me they'd keep an eye out. "Are you sure you didn't lend it to someone?" he asked, politely verifying. "Absolutely not," I replied firmly, my voice tight with anger. I ended the call, turning to see my wife and a few concerned neighbors. "Karen," I muttered, the name feeling bitter on my tongue. She's behind this. I'm almost positive. Before I could even think about my next move, an unexpected visitor arrived, Stan, the HOA president. And from the worry etched across his face, I could tell he'd already heard the rumors. Stan was breathless. Having jogged over the moment he heard the commotion. I just got a call. Someone told me your boat went missing. Is that true? I nodded. It's not missing. It's stolen. I'm pretty sure Karen took it. His eyebrows rose. Karen? Are you certain? I motioned for him to follow me inside. There, I pulled up the security camera footage on my computer. It wasn't crystal clear, but you could see the figure's hair, build, and the outfit that looked suspiciously like the pastel windbreaker Karen often wore. The boat left the dock in broad daylight, bold as can be. Stan rubbed his temples in frustration. Oh, for heaven's sake. Why would she do that? This is a serious matter. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone, I said, my voice shaking with pent-up anger. She's obsessed with my boat. She's been sniffing around, making thinly veiled threats. This morning, she just decided to take it. Stan let out a long sigh. I'll try to reach her phone. Maybe she'll pick up and offer some explanation. I nearly laughed at the word explanation. What explanation could possibly justify taking someone else's vessel without permission? Still, I wanted answers too. I watched Stan step out onto my porch and try calling Karen multiple times. No response. He left a tense voicemail. Karen, if you're on the water with that boat, you need to bring it back immediately. This is not a small infraction. Meanwhile, I stood by my dock, the emptiness amplified by the lapping waves. My wife stood next to me, arms crossed, occasionally glancing at her watch. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Neighbors murmured in small circles, speculating about Karen's whereabouts. Some wondered if she was just test driving it to prove a point and would return soon. Others worried she might have run into trouble. An hour passed. No word. The Coast Guard had taken my report, but said there wasn't much they could do unless they spotted the boat or received a distress signal. Then, abruptly, one of the neighbors shouted from shore, "Boat incoming." We all craned our necks. A speck in the distance gradually took shape. Sure enough, it was Seaworthy's Spirit, chugging along the channel. As it drew closer, I noticed how erratic the movements were. The boat wobbled side to side, as though its operator was fighting the current, or had no clue how to pilot a center console. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. If she crashed it into the dock, the hull could be severely damaged. I stood at the edge, motioning frantically, try to guide her in. But Karen, if that was indeed her at the helm, was making no effort to dock gracefully. In fact, she was aiming for the slip next to mine, an empty slip belonging to a seasonal resident. The boat swerved awkwardly, scraping against the piling with a piercing squeal of fiberglass on wood. I cringed. That was going to be expensive. Finally, the engine cut off. Karen stood at the console, her usually immaculate hair a tangled mess from the wind. She wore a triumphant smile, as though she'd just conquered the high seas. She waved at us with an air of self-satisfaction. I stormed over, my voice caught somewhere between anger and relief. Karen, what on earth? She didn't even flinch, just demonstrating to a potential buyer how wonderful our community amenities are, she announced, gesturing to a middle-aged couple crouched in the bow seat. They looked terrified. The man held a white-knuckled grip on the seat rail, and the woman's face was sheet white. Buyer, I sputtered. You got to be kidding me. The couple scrambled off the boat, more than happy to escape. The man stammered an apology to me. She told us it was her personal boat, part of her private tour. We didn't realize. Karen waved them away. They're considering purchasing a property here. I just wanted to offer a real taste of waterfront living. Isn't that what we do in this community? Show unity, share resources? I was speechless. My wife managed to find her voice first. Karen, you stole his boat. You had no right. Karen sniffed dismissively. Stole? Don't be dramatic. I'm on the board. I can facilitate community amenities for prospective buyers. It's in everyone's interest to raise property values, including yours. She said this as though it was the most logical statement on the planet. Just then, we heard sirens in the distance, though not the typical police kind. It was the Coast Guard's patrol boat approaching its speed. They must have spotted seaworthy spirits' mismatched path on the water and connected it to the theft report. My stomach twisted as I realized this was about to get very real. Karen's eyes widened slightly, but she pressed her lips together, attempting to maintain composure. A uniformed officer stepped off the patrol boat, meeting us at the dock. "Which one of you is the owner?" he asked. I raised my hand. The officer nodded. "We got your report. Everything all right here." I glanced at Karen, who had folded her arms defiantly. Her windbreaker was stained with sea spray, and her smugness was evaporating under the officer's stern gaze. "I want to press charges," I blurted, rage and relief swirling together. Karen's face flickered with panic. She opened her mouth, probably to protest, but the officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, I need to see proof of ownership and ID for both parties. Let's keep this orderly." Stan rushed forward, brandishing the HOA documents, as though they held some magical power to quell the situation. "Officer, we might be able to handle this internally." But the officer cut him off. "A stolen vessel is a serious federal offense. Internal HOA matters are one thing. Theft of a boat is another." His gaze landed squarely on Karen. "Ma'am, I hope you have a very good explanation." Karen tried to brazen it out. She recounted her version of events, smoothing the wrinkles in her windbreaker as though that could iron out her story. "Officer, this boat is part of our community's shared resources," she began. I nearly choked on the words. "It's not shared. It's privately owned. By me." She shot me a withering glare. "Well, you never let anybody else ride it. You keep it locked up as if it's only yours to enjoy." The officer's eyebrows inched higher. "Because it is his to enjoy." He looked at her, then at me. "Where is the registration, sir?" I handed over the paperwork. The officer examined it carefully, then turned to Karen. "Do you have permission from the registered owner to operate this vessel?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "This is a misunderstanding. I am on the HOA board and—" He held up a finger to stop her. "Yes or no? Did you have permission?" She finally shook her head. "Then I'm afraid this is theft, plain and simple," the officer said gravely. "We might call it unauthorized use, but it's still a criminal matter. You'll need to come with me." For a moment, Karen seemed to deflate. Her bravado wavered, and she shot a desperate look at Stan. "Wait, this can't be happening. I was just trying to help the community." Stan looked torn, but he said nothing. He knew better than to try to obstruct an official investigation. My wife, arms crossed, glared daggers at Karen, who was now trembling slightly. Despite my anger, I felt a flicker of pity. But that pity was drowned out by the memory of how she'd stolen my property, lied about it, and risked people's safety. The Coast Guard officer radioed for local police to come and handle the formalities. Within minutes, a squad car arrived. The policeman who stepped out was a stoic type. His face gave nothing away as he took statements from me, my wife, and the would-be buyers who'd been unfortunate passengers on Karen's unauthorized tour. They confirmed everything. Karen had approached them at an open house event in the neighborhood, promised a private boat ride to show them what the community was really about. She claimed it was her boat, her personal pride and joy. They only realized something was amiss when she struggled to start the engine and cursed about the ignition switch, saying he must have changed it on me again. By the end of that day, Karen was in handcuffs, charged with unauthorized use of a vessel and trespassing. It was surreal watching the police escort her away. This woman who'd for months tried to strong-arm me over petty HOA bylaws, now powerless under the weight of actual legal consequences. The neighbors looked on, some whispering in shock, others taking pictures with their phones. Stan tried to de-escalate the scene, telling the crowd, "Let's disperse, folks. Nothing more to see." But I knew this moment would be etched into the neighborhood's memory for a long time. Seaworthy's spirit floated nearby, battered and scraped along the hull, but still afloat. And in that battered hull, I saw not just damage to fiberglass, but the crumbling of Karen's illusions of grandeur. Later, I had to sit down with the officer to go over the next steps. I expressed my desire to press charges, partially because Karen had truly violated my trust, but also to protect others from her brazen sense of entitlement. She had endangered innocent people on that boat, along with the boat itself. The officer took down the details, gave me a case number, and told me to expect update from the district attorney's office about how they'd proceed. By dusk, the commotion settled. My wife and I were left gazing at Seaworthy Spirit in the slip. I ran my hand across the scratches on the hull. Some would need professional repair, but the engines seemed okay. I was thankful Karen hadn't managed to sink it or injure anyone. Stan approached, hands shoved into his pockets. He looked older than his years, like the weight of the entire HOA fiasco had settled on his shoulders. "I'm so sorry," he murmured. "I had no idea she would do something so extreme. Please don't hold this against the entire board." I let out a long breath. "I don't, but I hope you'll review how much power you give people like Karen. Maybe not let them roam around telling folks what they can do with their private property." He nodded, solemn. "Absolutely. The HOA will review her position and likely remove her. This is unprecedented." As far as official statements went, I expected no less. But the emotional side of me was still simmering, angry that I had to go through such an ordeal just to enjoy my retirement. I shook Stan's hand stiffly, not sure what else to say. I'd figure out how to repair the boat. What mattered now was setting a precedent in this community and for myself. I wasn't about to let a bully sabotage my peace. And if pressing charges against Karen taught the HOA a lesson about boundaries, so be it. But the drama wasn't quite over. Karen's arrest set off a chain of reactions, some from her family, some from the HOA's insurance, and some from neighbors who weren't so fond of me after all. A few believed Karen's line that I was hogging resources and that maybe I set her up just to prove a point, as if I would risk my own boat to do that. Amid all this, I braced myself for the next wave of conflict. Because in some twisted way, Karen wasn't done. She might have been physically removed, but her reach extended through the complicated web of HOA bylaws and her connections around the neighborhood. I could feel the fallout approaching like an oncoming storm. In the days following Karen's arrest, I heard from the police that she made bail. I wasn't surprised. She had resources and a network of connections. But I was relieved there was a protective order in place. She was legally barred from coming within 300 feet of my property or my boat. That meant I could finally relax, at least temporarily, without worrying about her sneaking around my dock at dawn. Yet the legal wheels moved slowly. The court date was weeks away. Meanwhile, the rumor mill churned day and night in our small waterfront community. A few neighbors left supportive messages in our mailbox, offering to help fix any damage. Others kept their distance, wary of getting involved. One or two openly complained that I'd gone too far by pressing charges, as if ignoring Karen's theft would have been the neighborly thing to do. Stan called an emergency HOA meeting to address the incident. With Karen absent, she was temporarily suspended from the board. He explained the seriousness of what had happened. He reiterated that the HOA had no authority over privately owned boats and that no one, not even a board member, could use someone else's property without permission. It was a straightforward condemnation of Karen's actions. Still, some members asked questions like, couldn't we have settled this without the police? Or is a criminal charge really necessary? I stood up, a calm fury in my gut, and said, if she had borrowed a rake without asking, maybe we could have handled it differently. But this was a boat on open water with people aboard. She lied about ownership, risked lives, and threatened property. That's not a small dispute. It's a crime. My voice reverberated in the hushed room. A few heads nodded in agreement, while others avoided my gaze. I walked out of that meeting feeling a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. Part of me was proud for standing my ground. Another part was just weary of the drama, hoping life could go back to normal. Little did I know, Karen had one more trick up her sleeve, delivered in the form of a letter from her attorney. The letter arrived a week later, typed on fancy letterhead. It claimed that Karen had been operating under the assumption that the boat was a shared HOA asset. It further stated she intended no harm and that pressing charges constituted malicious prosecution, implying I'd abused the legal system to harass her. The attorney demanded an out-of-court settlement, suggesting if I dropped the charges, Karen would consider covering the boat's minor damages. The subtext was clear: back off or prepare for a drawn-out legal battle. My blood boiled. The nerve of this woman, twisting facts to paint herself as a victim. I handed the letter to my own lawyer, who merely laughed. "Let them try," she said. "You have security footage, eyewitnesses, Coast Guard involvement, and the actual police report. Her claim is weaker than a sandcastle at high tide." Still, it was unsettling. I was dealing with an unrepentant individual who would rather double down on her lies than face the consequences. My lawyer assured me, "The charges are in the state's hands now. Even if you want to drop them, it's not entirely up to you." She's not negotiating from a position of strength. Time dragged on, and the court date approached. Meanwhile, Seaworthy Spirit underwent repairs at a local marine shop. They patched the hull, repainted the scratches, and realigned the damaged rail. It wasn't cheap, but it looked almost brand new when they were done. When I finally took it out on the water again, I felt a wave of relief and gratitude. This was why I moved here, to enjoy calm seas and quiet sunsets, not wage war with self-important neighbors. On the day of Karen's hearing, I dressed in a collared shirt, accompanied by my wife and a couple of supportive neighbors. We sat in the hard wooden benches of the courtroom, listening as the judge reviewed the facts. Karen's lawyer tried to spin a narrative of misunderstanding, citing her involvement with the HOA and her misguided belief that the boat was part of community outreach. The prosecutor methodically dismantled that claim, citing the explicit registration in my name, the eyewitness accounts, and the security footage showing Karen sneaking onto the boat. The judge looked unimpressed by the defense's arguments. After a brief recess, he returned with a verdict. Karen was found guilty of unauthorized use of a vessel and trespassing. The sentence wasn't extreme: probation, community service, and mandatory restitution for the boat repairs. But it was a clear admonishment. She was also ordered to stay away from me, my home, and my boat. If she violated any condition, she'd risk jail time. I remember looking at her face as the judge pronounced the sentence. Gone was the smugness I'd seen at the dock. She seemed smaller, drained of her usual bluster. Perhaps she finally realized her sense of entitlement had real-world consequences. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a peaceful routine. Karen's house went up for sale not long after. Some said she was moving to another neighborhood without an HOA. Others whispered she'd been pushed out by the remaining board members. I didn't really care which was true. All that mattered was that my dock stayed quiet, my boat stayed secure, and I could once again enjoy the gentle lull of the waves. I'd love to say I learned some grand, universal lesson from the whole ordeal, but sometimes life's lessons are simply about standing up for yourself when faced with boundary stompers. I learned that ignoring a bully rarely works. They just escalate until you push back. And push back I did with the backing of the law. Today, Seaworthy Spirit and I have finally found our slice of tranquility. I take her out on weekend fishing trips, no more anxious glances over my shoulder. I still keep the security camera aimed at the dock, more out of habit than necessity. And whenever a neighbor sidles up to me, hinting they'd love a ride, I just grin and say, "Knock on my door first." That's all it takes: permission. Because that's the crux of living in any community: respect for others' boundaries. If you want something, you ask. You don't break in, you don't sneak around, and you definitely don't hijack a boat for a quick ride in the name of community outreach. Karen learned that the hard way, and I learned that a little pushback can go a long, long way toward keeping your life and your boat exactly where it should be. The end.